Ian Arcrane, thank you very much for talking to RT here in Brighton. Now, tell me, what is deep geopolitics?
Deep geopolitics is looking at the underlying global agenda. It's an agenda that is multi-generational and outside the bounds of, shall I say, the day-to-day perception that's presented in the mainstream media.
Some people say that what you do is essentially fear-mongering amongst the general population. What's your reaction to that?
People will go through fear as they start to realise what's occurring, and they'll also go through anger. But when they actually get through that and they start to see the bigger picture, then it actually is very empowering to be able to actually understand what's going on and see that bigger picture.
Middle East, we've seen a wave of revolutions across North Africa and the Middle East. You have things that you call false flag events. Do you think that these revolutions also were false flag events?
At this stage of the game, it's very difficult to say. I think that things in the Middle East have been unfolding at a phenomenal rate of knots. What I do perceive, though, is that the ultimate target was indeed Libya all along. Let's just have a look at a couple of things here. On January the 4th of this year, the UN was about to release a report which actually was praising Gaddafi as a model leader in the Arab world. And let's just also recognise one remarkable piece of coincidence. All of the countries that are tagged by the mainstream media on behalf of the political elite, all of the countries tagged, such as Venezuela, Cuba, Libya, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, all have one thing in common, or had one thing in common, and that is they are free of debt from the World Bank. That they are not locked into the World Bank and the IMF. They have their own banks, they issue their own currency. And we also have to recognise the remarkable coincidence between Gaddafi's statement that he was going to start issuing gold dinar and demanding that his oil was purchased in gold. And then the next thing we know, of course, then we have a popular uprising. Now, this was brilliant. It was a brilliant strategy, because when Tony Blair and George Bush announced in 2002 that they were planning to launch a regime change event on Iraq, millions of people hit the streets across the Western world. But this time, effectively, the same has or is in process in Libya as was done in Iraq. What would that be, 8 years ago, in 2003. And yet this time, because, if you like, the scene was set through other popular uprisings, Libya just seemed to be the next natural part of the process.
And then the next natural part of the process, it seems, is Syria now. The EU has just applied sanctions to Syria. What do you see developing in that situation?
Well, I think actually what's happening elsewhere, particularly in Syria, is deliberately contrived to take the attention away from Libya. The goal is Libya. The goal is control of not just the oil in Libya. Libya's debt was less than 1 month of its GDP. So it was no debt, that was just working capital. But it's not just the oil, because in addition to supporting his country, I mean, let's understand that, Gaddafi paid a social wage. Every Libyan of working age received the equivalent of $1,000 a month. And it was up to them whether they worked or not. So, Gaddafi was putting money back into the community. All education was free. He was not in debt to the World Bank. I'm not suggesting that everything about Gaddafi was wonderful. I think the appropriate term to describe Gaddafi would be a benevolent despot. But nonetheless, he wouldn't buy into the overtures of the World Bank. He was also spending a significant chunk of the oil revenues on developing the massive ancient underground aquifers. And he developed an incredible engineering network to take the water from these aquifers and effectively turn the northern Sahara Desert, the Libyan Sahara, into arable farmland. So this would potentially not only make Libya even more independent, but also enable it to effectively become a pseudo-superpower, within that region.
I have to ask you this question. I'm listening to you talking. Do you consider yourself to be a conspiracy theorist?
No, I analyse the deep geopolitical agenda. In reality, more and more people are starting to realise that the mythology that is put out by the mainstream media is nothing more than a political construct. And of course that's been demonstrated literally in the last few days with the sudden manifestation of a certain birth certificate, which when it appeared on the White House website was immediately identified as being a forgery because it was still in the Photoshop layers. In the event that the media, particularly of course the US media, then needed something of enormous magnitude to take the birth certificate issue off of the front pages, so they decided that they needed to murder Osama bin Laden for what is at least the third time. And I don't make that observation likely because we have people who are very were close to the US administration in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, who have stated that Osama bin Laden was dead before the end of 2001. And then, of course, we have the iconic interview between David Frost and Benazir Bhutto in November of 2007, where Benazir Bhutto stated categorically that Omar Sheikh had murdered Osama bin Laden. And David Frost made no comment whatsoever. He let it go completely unquestioned, despite the fact that this was, breaking news, or should have been breaking news. But Benazir Bhutto, of course, unfortunately paid a tragic price for revealing that little gem of information, because 5 weeks after that interview with David Frost, she herself was assassinated.
So you're saying that the supposed assassination of Osama bin Laden was in an attempt to cover up the allegations that Obama wasn't born in the United States? It's
certainly having that effect, isn't it? And of course now what's happening is that the story is unraveling. It's unraveling rapidly. The US administration is finding it extremely difficult to stay with a single script because more and more people are starting to spot holes in the script, and of course as they ask more questions, and it's like any lie. Once people are exposed as lying and you probe that lie, then they have to come up with more lies to cover the gaps in the original lie. I mean, we saw this piece of footage that was released that was allegedly Osama bin Laden watching TV in his luxury compound. And I mean, close analysis of that photograph shows that it's nothing like any of the photographs of Osama bin Laden. But I mean, this story has still got some legs. I'm not suggesting that after a few days we know all the facts. But what I am suggesting is that people should not be taking the version of events offered by the mainstream media at face value, and we should actually take it as beholden upon all of us to dig as deeply as possible to establish what we believe to be the truth.
It's just over a year since the massive oil spill from BP in the Gulf of Mexico. You suggest that it wasn't in fact caused by a technical failure or incompetence in any way, that you think that something deeper and more sinister lurks behind it.
Well, my reason for that belief is that there are some very, very important questions that both BP and the US government have done their utmost to make sure don't get asked. And to be very specific, the Deepwater Horizon at the time had one of BP's most experienced company men on the rig. It was a guy called Ronald Sepulvado. And Sepulvado was taken off the rig supposedly to attend a course in Lafayette, Louisiana. Now, it's remarkable that BP's most experienced company man should be taken off the rig to learn how to use the BOP at the most significant juncture of the drilling operation, i.e. just as the well's about to reach completion. The person that was put on the rig to replace Sepulvado was a guy called Bob Kaluza. Now, Bob Kaluza is the complete antithesis of Sepulvado. He was a young guy, he had no deep water drilling experience, his only experience was land drilling, and he was the main man, he was the head honcho on the rig when the disaster occurred. Why
BP would want to deliberately pour oil into the Gulf of Mexico?
I'm not suggesting that the script was actually written by BP. In fact, individuals within BP, unfortunately, are potentially part of, how shall I say, a hidden hierarchy. The questions need to be asked. Who took the decision to put Bob Kaluza on that rig? These are questions that haven't been properly answered by the Gulf Coast hearings. And Bob Kaluza has declined to appear before the Gulf Coast hearing by pleading the Fifth Amendment, i.e. that if he does give evidence, any evidence he gives may likely incriminate him. And people can look this up for themselves and see the YouTube video clip of the United States Senate deliberately overturning the request for the Gulf Coast hearings to be given the power of subpoena. Now, if the Gulf Coast hearing had been given the power of subpoena, it could have not only demanded that Bob Kaluza actually appear before the hearing, it could have demanded that Bob Kaluza shares what he knows occurred on that rig immediately prior to the blowout.
What could possibly be the reason for essentially deliberately spilling millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico?
What is the purpose of it? I believe that the purpose of this was a population reduction event. We've already seen elements of population reduction in the Gulf Coast area after Katrina, where many of the black residents of the area have not returned to New Orleans. In some cases, they haven't been permitted to return to New Orleans because there's absolutely nowhere for them to go because they're not being permitted to return to their former residence.
So what you're suggesting is that governments and big business are colluding to cull populations. And why would they target the population that lives on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico?
Because basically they want to turn it into a massive oil production arena. The reality is that the effects of that disaster are not being reported and have never been reported really outside of the Gulf Coast region. It's not just the oil and the mix of the dispersant corrects it. And Corexit is extremely toxic. Its toxicity is 10 times that of oil alone. And the reason that Corexit was poured onto the slick was to break up the slick, but also to force it below the surface of the Gulf. Because under federal law, a BP's liability would be related to the size of the visible slick. So if you can remove the visible slick, then you reduce the liability. Now, the other effect that that's having is that it's actually killing the marine life in the Gulf because it's causing a dead zone. Because as the slick descends, then all life beneath it effectively dies because it's not getting the natural sunlight.
Ian R. Crane, thank you very much.
Thank you.